College Football Nerds here talking Florida and Tennessee. Josh is back from vacation, so no more solo mission for Daniel. I did do a solo live show if you want to check it out. But we're talking SEC football in this one. And Josh, let's just dive into it. We're going to have a quick conversation. We were talking about this game and sort of, who they've played and what they've looked like so far. And we're going to get into some of that. But just off the jump, when we're talking about these two teams, isn't it kind of hard to really gauge either one of them, considering Tennessee's not really played anyone, and they're going to say, wait, Pitt, but Pitt's not great this year in my opinion, and Slovis went down, for half that game he didn't play. And on the flip side, Florida's played a couple of good teams, though we've got our skepticism about Utah and Kentucky, and then not a great team in South Florida, but Florida's definitely played more competition. Does that make it kind of hard to judge this game?
It does. It's 3 weeks of data, right? We don't run our computer model until at least this point in the season. Even now, we'll get into the model later. Slight spoiler, it's weird. And that's sort of the reality that we're having to deal with, and that's why we're trying to bring in this issue up as early as possible. I do think Florida's played better competition. I think Utah and Kentucky were obviously more complete teams, but even there's a lot of hype around Will Levis, but I think Kentucky is limited offensively in a lot of ways. I think Utah is somewhat limited offensively. They don't have a lot of balance and explosion, at least not the same way Tennessee does. And on the other side, when you look at Tennessee, I don't know that they really played anyone that's as complete as Florida in a lot of other ways. I think Pitt defensively is really good, but I think offensively, again, very limited. And even defensively, their jury's still out on exactly where they're at. I mean, their front's expected to still be pretty good this year, but the rest of it, I don't think we really know. So it is difficult to pick these games. It's really hard to evaluate. I tried to go back and look at these teams as much as I could, and watching the games live and going back and doing it on a rewatch, I still have a hard time trying to figure out where I feel like these two teams are, and I think that's just really indicative of where we're at in the season and the reality of how difficult it really is to judge ranked teams, especially when you have ranked teams going into, a big ranked matchup in conference play.
Yeah, and, one thing worth noting in looking at that South Florida game, they couldn't throw the ball. Bohannon was terrible. I think like 4-something yards per attempt. But they did run the ball really well, both from the quarterback position and, straight standard running back yards. Tennessee didn't run it well in their one, opponent with a pulse. But obviously we know Tennessee's going to play a lot of plays. We know they're going to throw the ball a lot. And if I'm a Florida fan, I'm a little concerned on two fronts. One, they haven't seen a good passing attack this year. Utah's not a great passing team. They kind of manufacture yards, manufacture drives a lot from, quarterback escape and contain, being tough, getting 3-4 yards of play. They haven't faced a real passing attack. And they're about to face a team that runs a buttload of plays, Josh. And I like Florida's starting defense, but I've got some concerns about their reserves and their depth. Is this a situation where, like, if you're going to pick Tennessee to win this game, might it be pretty close mid-third quarter and that depth kind of kick in, sort of like we saw LSU Mississippi State last weekend?
I think it's certainly an argument. I mean, Josh Heupel's system is really challenging for teams that have limited depth. They do run a tremendous number of plays. It messes a lot of times with the way people look at them statistically because it affects total yardage, but I think it really is a big challenge for teams that don't have a ton of depth. And Florida's problem is that they're still dealing with the recruiting that McElwain and Dan Mullen left them. Our years and years ago, our constant complaint when people would bring up Dan Mullen as the coach they'd want to hire was always, look, I think he'd never been better than 6th in the SEC West, something like that in recruiting. Like, the guy had never recruited well, even when he had a good season. And the same thing carried true at Florida. He did not recruit well, did not leave the cupboard with a lot of talent. And then obviously McElwain didn't either. That still has a major effect on Florida's depth chart. And the funny thing on Tennessee's side is they had a lot of problems. They inherited a bit of a mess from Pruitt. But they did actually recruit pretty well, and they did, I think, across the board, recruit at a pretty good clip. So the if you think about the way these two teams sort of panned out over the past 5 years, I don't think it's indicative of where the talent and depth is between them. I think Tennessee actually has a lot of edges in the depth department. I'm with you. I like Florida's starters, but in kind of strangely, given the success of the last few years, I actually think I like Tennessee's depth better, and that plays into their hands given the style of play that they want to roll out on Saturday.
Yeah, and speaking of depth, we don't know for sure. Y'all let us know in the comments. I don't think that Cedric Tillman is we don't know if he's going to play or not. He said he was fine after he got hurt Saturday. They had a couple other injuries Saturday that Josh, they didn't need him. It was Akron. Name your score kind of situation. So it's probably that we're going to see these players come back. I don't know if Nate Pierce made an announcement on Miller, who didn't play against South Florida. They actually had a few guys out, and that also might kind of make us overplay the closeness of that South Florida game, because they did have a lot of guys out, and it was on the heels of two really tough games. So I think for a lot of people that are completely writing off Florida in this game, they need to understand that they're already thin. They got guys hurt. They're playing a team who is playing their Super Bowl. South Florida players would love to beat Florida. And they're the only team in the country that opened with two really good opponents. I guess the only team in the country that's not going out taking paycheck games. So for me, that one, I think, is going to throw the numbers off, and this is where I segue into the model. But two, I think that people who think that Florida has no chance in this game just because of maybe rankings or what they saw against South Florida need to realize that Florida was probably out of gas at that point, and they need to recover a little bit, and they could going into Tennessee. So why don't you give us the model, give the caveat of I'm going to give the caveat. It's week 4, first week of the model. It's going to be wonky, but Josh, pull back the curtain. Let us see what you got.
Sure. So as you said, it's week 4. The model is going to be wonky. There's a reason we don't like to run this model anytime earlier than we have to. And yeah, so as a presser, first model of the season, our model takes only this season's in-game data. And what it does is it looks at your team and creates a profile. It looks at the other team, creates a profile. It looks at the matchups between the two teams. And based off your team and your profile, it has essentially a scoring model that's unique to your team. And it looks at the matchups to sort of figure out how this game is going to go from like a yardage production standpoint. And then based off that scoring model, it tries to predict how your team's going to score in that given game. The problem with it is we only use current in-game regular season data. So this early in the year, it is really wonky, and we want to preface that we know the strengths and weaknesses of it. It is what it is. There's reasons we do it this way. But in this one, I think it's interesting because it has Tennessee big. It has Tennessee 49, Florida 21. And how does it arrive at that? Well, the first thing to note is that Florida's defensive statistics in our modeling system are not very good. And when I say that, I mean they're allowing 114% of opponent rushing averages and 91% of opponent passing averages. So usually 90% is about average for a P5 team because you're playing down competition, right? Florida's hurt a little bit because they did have to play Utah and Kentucky, but you still have that game against South Florida, which ideally means you should get a little bit of a bump because you're comparing what South Florida did against other teams in a G5 as to what South Florida did against Florida. Should be a different level of competition. You should be a little bit better than average, and they're not. They're allowing about 15% worse than those other teams all collectively have done against other competition. 91% against the pass is perfectly average. I don't think Tennessee's defense is great, which the model's saying. 97% of opponent rushing averages is pretty bad, especially given the level of competition. 82% of opponent passing averages is actually solid enough, but again, I question it a little bit with the competition level. The problem is that Tennessee already starts at some major advantages, particularly throwing the football. Florida, 5.5 yards per attempt on the year against FBS competition is horrid. And so when Tennessee has literally double the per play production throwing the football that Florida has, and you consider where Florida's at defensively, that just gives Tennessee a huge edge. 7 yards per play for Tennessee projected, almost 10 yards per attempt is monstrous. That means you're moving the ball almost every time you want to. Florida at 5.5 is doing okay. They're going to move the ball. The model's saying that they're going to score in the 20s. It's just, man, the moment anybody crosses that 7-yard per play threshold, almost always the score starts to absolutely skyrocket, because at that point you don't really ever have to get to third down, right? So if you could get a first down in 2 plays, you don't normally need 3. The game gets out of hand pretty quickly, and that's what the model is saying. And I'll go ahead and throw this out because I pulled it up to see if the model was totally crazy. Vegas has this an 11-point spread in Tennessee's favor, so this model seems way off, and I do think it's overinflated, but it's not completely out of the ballpark, I think, or out of reason given where Vegas has this game pegged.
I think that the model, and I wonder because Tennessee did have some overtime points, I think just 7, but I think the model right now can't account for the badness of the bad, so like how bad Akron is, but it can maybe it might be underselling South Florida a little bit because of how bad BYU beat them, and then BYU got crushed. So there is some downstream effect there. But the one area that I think that is maybe a little off is the rush defense. I think that South Florida had an uncharacteristically good day. If they play that game 10 times, they're not getting the 6.6 or whatever yards per carry they got against Florida, especially if Florida had a little bit of rejuvenation time and wasn't just beat up after Kentucky. But I do think the points for Florida are pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and give my score prediction. I've got Florida 24, Tennessee 34, and I think these teams are about even though they're completely different types of teams in terms of their approach. I'm giving Tennessee 6 points for the home field advantage, and I'm giving them 4 points for the depth that I think they're going to get into in the fourth quarter. I think Florida's a good football team that needs a quarterback, and I know that Florida fans don't want to hear this, but we keep it real on this show. We've been consistent, and when he proves us wrong, we will eat our crow. But up until this point, he has not proven us wrong. Anthony Richardson is a great athlete who is a one-read quarterback who is not very accurate and can't expose a defense that can't play pass defense. So it makes him a one-dimensional player, and he's not running an offense. If you watch Florida play, they're scratching and clawing together about mid-20s types of points. That's what their offense is every game, whether they're playing a decent team or a bad team. It's not consistent moving the ball down the field. It's scratching and scraping to find some points on the board. You can't live like that. That's not executing an offense. And if you can't do that at home, I'm really concerned that some of the road problems are going to just amplify any of your issues. So that's what I've got, 34-24 Tennessee. I don't have them quite covering the 11 that Vegas is giving up to Florida. So tell me what you got.
Well, Daniel wouldn't let me tell him my score in advance, so I couldn't tell him that it was 34-24. So because of that, I think I'm just going to, for the sake of being different, I'll say 37-24 and go the other side of the spread.
The cover.
I actually think the 11-point spread's a pretty accurate number, to be honest. And I agree with you. I have been labeled a hater so many times in the past year and a half because of my comments on Anthony Richardson. I think his talent level's through the roof. I think he's going to be drafted fairly high. The guy I would compare him to is a very different type of player, but it's sort of a Logan Thomas situation where someone's going to draft him second round because of his potential, and he's not anywhere close to a second-round quarterback today in terms of his ability to produce. And it's the same sort of stuff we saw early mid-season last season, and everyone hated on Dan Mullen for it. But there are a lot of things about how you run the quarterback position that Richardson doesn't currently do well. His checks at the line, his ability to make reads, particularly hot reads, blitzes, teams that can play good, competent defense and actually bring pressure, force you to do something, give you an open, like you said, maybe you're not sound on the back end. You let a guy go free. Richardson may not see it. And so that lets you bring a lot of exotic pressures. And when he does see it, he may miss the throw. And when people do that, it really, really messes with an offense because you can take a lot of gambles against Richardson and those gambles always have a reward. You know, the pressures or whatnot. You always get extra pressure. You always get extra help in the run game, but the risk is greatly lessened by his inability to execute currently. Developmentally, he's just not there. So I think it is a big advantage, and I think Florida's defense is still pretty suspect. I think they're doing a lot better, but they haven't gotten all the way there yet. I think Tennessee. I will say my personal bit of concern. I know that, in that receiving core, everybody's focused on Cedric Tillman. I do think they miss Velus Jones and some other guys. I don't feel like they have the all-around explosiveness that they had last year. I think they still have some really good pieces, but there's a difference with having some really good pieces and having a bunch of really good pieces. And I don't know that they're quite there, but quite frankly, I have a lot of concerns about Florida's defense. And so I do think Tennessee's going to score a lot like our model in Vegas seems to suggest. That makes me heavily favor Tennessee in this game. And again, the depth issue, everything just sort of compounds on Florida. I think Tennessee is the smart pick here, certainly straight up. And against the spread, 11 points is a pretty neutral line.
And look, this is a brutal open to an overall brutal schedule. And what did we say after Florida beat Utah? They're about the 15th best team in the country. They're going to be overrated a little bit after the win against Utah. And then, they're going to lose some games just because of the collective, toughness of their schedule that's going to make them fall out of favor with voters when they're actually better than their record is going to, signal. And after this game, they get a bit of a break. Eastern Washington, Missouri, and then LSU at home. That LSU game is going to be tough because LSU is better than they're getting credit for. But at least you got Eastern Washington, Missouri to kind of get things together, and then a bye week after LSU. So I'll be interested in this stretch. If they can go 3-1 in this stretch of 4 games, then they're heading into Georgia 5-2. So that wouldn't be too bad. I could see that as I would consider that a good move. A good season so far going into the Georgia game with a pretty brutal back half of their schedule. All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to be. Obviously, our model is a little drunk right now, but that's how it is in the early part of the season. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.